Okay, so today's chosen topic is the Jewish people's surprising qualifications for chosenness. Now, the Midrash actually starts out talking about Noach and debating whether he makes the cut as somebody who is chosen. After all, he built the ark as God commanded. On the other hand, he didn't get a single person to go on board outside of his own immediate family. The Torah certainly portrays him as a bright spot on the horizon after God decided to bring the flood about the world. And it says in that pasuk, V'noach matzachein be'neha. Interesting about that pasuk is everyone assumes it means that God looked at Noah and found favor in his eyes, but literally it means that Noah was the one who found favor. In other words, Noah chose God, but God didn't necessarily choose Noah. This is, of course, a debate in the Midrash, but let's get to our topic about the chosen people. So first, let's start with the list. Then the Midrash gives a list of who were chosen, and there are three on that list: Abraham, King David, and the Jewish people. Okay, so let's talk about the tests that each one went through. So Abraham had these famous 10 tests in his lifetime, but two of them actually happened before God ever communicated directly with him. There was a very powerful person named Nimrod who wanted to kill him, and you may remember the famous Midrash where he's thrown in a pit, a fiery pit, a furnace. So these two tests came before God even communicated him, which means, Avram was willing to give his life for a God that he hadn't yet directly communicated with him. He just had this idea of monotheism and this belief that he was spreading around the world, and everybody hated this idea. It was very threatening to their idolatry. So as far as King David, he also had some pretty formidable tests before God spoke to him directly. His father-in-law was trying to kill him. His father-in-law happened to be the king of Israel, King Saul. And even his confrontation, David and Goliath, was also a test that happened before God communicated him directly. And thirdly, let's say the Jewish people, well, they went through some very tough times. They were slaves for 210 years in Egypt. And so what's interesting is that God sets up the parameters for these tests to make it very tough. And, if in order to get chosen, you have to come through very, very difficult and challenging tests. So let's talk now about what these criteria are. So the Yefei Toar, which is a commentator on Parshat Rabbah, lists three tests. And I hinted at the first one already. That is that everyone who made it to this list was sort of unlikely candidate. Even though they went through these tests and they showed tremendous character, but they themselves were unlikely candidates. In other words, let's start with Avram. His father was a idol worshiper. His father had a cash and carry idol business. So who would ever expect Avram to be the one chosen to be, introduce the world to monotheism, being the forefather of the Jewish people? King David had some questions about his, legitimacy, even though the Torah clearly says, the rabbinic sources clearly say that he and all his brothers came from the same father and mother. His own father, Yishai, doubted the legitimacy of his son. And so this sort of had a cloud over King David, and he was unlikely to be chosen. And lastly, the Jewish people, why were they unlikely? They were a bunch of slaves, and they were still very much tied into idolatry. So for them to be chosen is also very unlikely. The second criteria is interesting. It's described as when you find a lost object, you can claim it as yours. You don't have to pay for it. In other words, it's something that sort of comes for free, and that's really what I was talking about at the beginning. In other words, the character development, God didn't have to invest time in character development that he had communicated directly that I'm going to give you this test and that test. God could sit back and watch the character development on its own without investing any time and energy, so to speak, and then if those who merit it would make the cut. So of course, in the case of Avram, as I said, he withstood these tremendous tests on his own without being communicated to. Same with King David. He developed this bravery and love of the Jewish people and love of God before he was communicated, and the Jewish people also fit this criteria because here they are. Judaism is the only religion in the world which has a revelation in front of millions of people, and the Jewish people, even though they were slaves and were still somewhat attached to idolatry, God felt that they were ready. God didn't have to invest in trying to give them a lot of material, and God didn't send them to yeshiva first. They were slaves. They came out. Maybe they weren't adequately ready for that revelation, but God thought they were ready. In all cases, God thought they were ready, and that's how you made the list. So there's a fourth criteria I could add, and that comes from the Malbim. And the Malbim's talking about how the 10 tests that Avram had were actually something that God had an ongoing relationship with Avram, even after he revealed himself. The whole process of chosenness continues. In other words, it's not you make the grade, you get your certification, you're chosen. What the Malbim is adding is, no, this is lifelong. God is always looking at anyone who's chosen throughout their whole life and making sure that they don't slip up. I mean, all of Jewish history could be, summarized in one statement that God gives us, small or large tests to keep us in line. That is what Jewish history is about. And that's really the very important part of being the chosen people, is that God is always watching us and keeping us in line, giving us tests, the chances to grow and develop, but also nudges us in very significant ways to to kind of rediscover our roots in our relationship with Him. I would then conclude that the famous Midrash that talks about when God was giving the Torah, He went to all the different nations and said, "You want the Torah?" And they turned them down. They asked, "What's in your Torah?" And they heard you can't steal, and some heard you can't murder, and some heard sexual immorality. So they turned down God. I would perhaps add that these nations, this is what they told God, the reason they're turning them down. I'm sure it was true, but I bet you that this last criteria of chosenness that we're talking about, I believe that they had rejected this formidable conditions of ongoing chosenness. In other words, they didn't want God on their case for their entire life. They thought, okay, if I can get in the club, that's fine, but I don't want God scrutinizing us and demanding that we meet a certain moral level ongoing. It's an ongoing relationship. I bet that was what really scared them away. Anyways, that is part of being the chosen people, and I hope this clarified all the other interesting and unlikely, surprising conditions that make up the Jewish people. Have a great Shabbos.